This 160,000 is just trying to replenish troops that they've lost already and allow the Russians to potentially survive a few more days. Ukraine can afford to trade space for time. It is a war of attrition and it's a war of innovation. Effectively, and paraphrasing the general, what he said was, Kaliningrad is very vulnerable. We could take it much more quickly than Russia could react to us going in. And he then went on, which I'm slightly surprised at, to say that we have planned and exercised the capture of Kaliningrad. Not something that the United States and NATO will have done, but for him to openly admit it like that in a public domain is something that's new, and that's sending a very clear message to Moscow, I think. I do hope it is a new tactic from the United States and from NATO to be more proactive in the information space. We have allowed the Russians to control that for too long now, and it's something that Western militaries have real difficulty doing because of the political dimension that there is to it. I've spoken to a number of generals and admirals and air marshals who say it's easier to get authority to fire a missile or to kill someone than it is to send a tweet. That suggests the difficulties that we have in our military in working in the information domain. Yeah, Russia's response is 100% what expected. You do this, we'll escalate. Nuclear. They always come out with that as their threat. They did that whenever the West was going to support Ukraine. We did that. They did that whenever they thought we were going to supply main battle tanks to Ukraine. They did that when they thought we were going to supply F-16s to Ukraine. I've lost track of the number of threats of nuclear escalation that the Russian commentators have put out. They've never lived up to them. And actually, the important thing is analysing the readiness of the Russian nuclear capability, their nuclear forces. This is something that Western intelligence is very heavily focused on, and they have seen no change in status and readiness of the Russian nuclear forces, even when these threats of escalation come out. Putin threatens. You could then add whatever you want in there, because Putin has threatened anything and everything. If he jams Western satellites, a large proportion of the satellites are US satellites. They're designed not to be jammed. So good luck. And B, that would be direct action against the United States. And if we go back to the last Secretary General of NATO turned around and said that there are certain instances where a cyber attack could be construed as an attack requiring an Article 5 response from NATO. Putin doesn't want that. He really doesn't want that. So it's all jaw. It's all threats. He may have the capability to do it. What's more worrying is his capability to carry out physical attacks against satellites and take a level of conflict into space. But if he did that, he would be escalating enormously, and it would potentially lead to a more regional, if not a global conflict. The Russian summer offensive, it started 6-8 weeks ago, and they have not been achieving an awful lot apart from continuing to feed the meat grinder. They're losing over 1,000 troops a day, whether that's dead or severely wounded. But because of the lack of medical care that there is in the front line, a large proportion of severely wounded Russian troops die within a few days or a week of getting wounded. So this 160,000 is just trying to replenish troops that they've lost already, and allow the Russians to potentially survive a few more days with the tactics that they're using. Large numbers of them are not properly trained. Their equipment is very poor. Putin and his commanders know that they've got through the summer months, so they've got 6-8 weeks left before we start to get the autumn rains coming in and the ground becomes virtually impassable. But the front line is moving in meters, not very much at all. And what you're finding is the Ukrainians are drawing the Russians in, killing thousands of them, or killing and wounding thousands of them. The Russians advance a few hundred meters and then they stop. They can't get the reinforcements forward, and the Ukrainians are counterattacking back and taking the territory back again. Kaliningrad, because it's completely surrounded by NATO countries, and it's surrounded by the NATO Sea, the Baltic Sea, I should call it, to give it its real name, but it is in effect the NATO Sea. It's controlled completely by NATO countries now that we've got Finland and Sweden having joined NATO. There's a tiny little bit that Russia's got with its port, and we control the airspace and we control all the surrounding land. So it would be very straightforward if NATO wanted to attack into Kaliningrad to capture that and take it. Of course, if NATO did attack in then Vladimir Putin would see that potentially as an existential threat to Russia, and could escalate very quickly. But I think the general's comments are wrestling the initiative in the information domain, because the Russians are always very quick at turning around and threatening severe consequences for different things and threatening other parts of the world. And of course, they have illegally carried out full-scale invasion of Ukraine and captured Ukrainian territory, having started that in 2014 when they illegally captured Crimea. So this is just a little dose of their own medicine being given back to them. We've got continuous deadlock. It is First World War trench warfare, but in a modern era. First World War trench warfare was broken by innovation, and the innovation was the tank. And the British brought the tank, and that allowed the infantry swathes to be backed up by something that couldn't be stopped by the Germans. And that brought fear. We're seeing exactly the same with the growth of drone technology, whether that be the flying drones or the autonomous ground vehicle drones and everything else. And we're seeing it with the development of what air forces have been able to drop as well. It's a race against time. The Ukrainians have just launched an initiative to allow different Western defense companies to come and effectively beta test their weapons on the front line in Ukraine and give them priorities for that. Russia is almost certainly doing the same, and it wouldn't surprise me if the Chinese are beta testing a lot of their weapon systems on the front line in Ukraine. It is a war of attrition, and it's a war of innovation. And at the moment, we're probably on both in a situation that we can only describe as stalemate. Putin's not going to have huge successes in his offensive. There'll not be any massive changes. If we look at the territory that he had when he carried out his initial full-scale invasion 3 years ago and the territory that he's got now, he's lost an awful lot of what he had initially captured. Most of what he had originally captured, he's lost. The Ukrainians have managed to hold him in the east. Ukraine is huge. Ukraine can afford to trade space for time. And as long as they do something with that time that they're generating, and they're doing that by increasing the Ukrainian defense manufacturing capability, increasing the professionalism of the troops, getting further Western support, bringing more Western weapons in, at the cost that it's taking the Russians to take this territory, which is huge in manpower and equipment terms. And we just need to look at what Russia is relying on now. It's relying on 40+% of its ammunition coming from North Korea. That is scary. And we're now seeing Russia relying on manpower coming from North Africa, North Korea, and elsewhere. That is scary from a Russian perspective as well. Putin's extremely concerned about the increased NATO capability and increasing NATO, the size of NATO. One of his strategic objectives for carrying out his full-scale invasion of Ukraine was to capture Ukraine and have it as a buffer between Russia and NATO. He actually stimulated the growth of NATO, because we got Finland and Sweden who applied to join and have been admitted as members of NATO, with Finland having a very large 800 to 900 kilometer border with Russia. So he's got NATO, he's got a large NATO border. Putin does not like that at all. And therefore, seeing an increasingly powerful NATO, seeing a NATO that is coming together politically and militarily much more, is something that is definitely worrying him.